Continue the discussion around rebuilding trust between government and South Africans. And we focus the attention specifically on the Eskom exemption withdrawal now by National Treasury. And we speak to energy economist Lungile Mashele. Lungile, good morning to you and thank you for your time. I want to kick off the conversation with a question that was, I think, repeated a number of times by the committee members in Parliament yesterday that were questioning the Treasury officials, and it is, was this an attempt to cover up yet more corruption that was going to likely take place at Eskom through this gazette?
First, equally, good morning to you and your viewers. The way that the gazette, the verbiage was used or the wording, it was most certainly going to cover up a lot of corruption, and this is why it had to be withdrawn and it has to be rewritten. Allow me just to explain why there's a perception of corruption and why it had to be withdrawn. If you look at state-owned entities, they have what we call fruitless and wasteful expenditure. They also have irregular expenditure. This does not mean any corruption happened. All it means, in a very simple example, is that if National Treasury has said that a hotel room is 1,500 a night, and you book a hotel room and it is 1,800 a night, you now need to write a deviation memo for the additional 300 rand. At the end of the year, this is all consolidated into what we call a condemnation, which needs to go back to National Treasury, and you need to explain to them that the average hotel room has now increased. Now, these condemnations, National Treasury has a severe backlog. In 2022, they only approved about 18 of these condemnations, amounting to about 527 million. So ultimately, all the billions that still need to be processed have not been done. By the time that the auditors come and the AG comes, when they're sitting with all these irregular expenditures, these additional 300 rands, it begins to look like some corrupt activity happens or happened, which is not necessarily true. Yes, there is corrupt activity like at Eskom, but just to give you an example, if you look at 2021, for instance, at Eskom, their irregular expenditure, which does not always mean corrupt, was sitting at about 59 billion. End of 2022 financial year, it was sitting at 67 billion. If you look at the losses due to corruption, this is sitting at about 2.8 billion as of end of 2022. So there's a vast difference between what is corrupt and what is just not, you're not able to change or account for it through the PFMA and through the National Treasury quick enough, ultimately.
Yeah. Lungile, I don't know if I'm going to oversimplify this, but I'm hoping to paraphrase just some of what the Minister of Finance had to say to parliamentarians yesterday, and that is that part of the rationale behind this was that Eskom needs to look good to its creditors for them to be able to raise the money that that utility so desperately needs. And so for them to do that, they needed to effect this exemption. However, if that is not done, then it means whenever Eskom runs out of money, they are going to go to National Treasury for yet more bailouts. And we know constantly what we are told about the government's finances, that they are under pressure. You just only have to look at the debt to GDP ratio for you to understand that. So if Eskom doesn't succeed here, is there an existential crisis for the utility?
Oh, absolutely. One of the key things, and I think it's such a pity that the Gazette was allowed to run loose, if I may, for the entire weekend without proper communication from National Treasury or from Eskom itself on why there was this request and why this exemption was actually required. But one of the key things is that these SOEs account and report on fruitless and wasteful and irregular expenditure means that it increases on an annual basis. So it looks like they're not doing anything to curb corruption, or they're not doing anything to curb this irregular expenditure, whereas they are hamstrung by the likes of DPE and by the likes of National Treasury itself. So ultimately, when they need to go to market on an annual basis to go and get additional funding for their capex or operational requirements, one of the very first things that they are asked, whether it's by creditors, lenders, whether it's by ratings agencies, but we see this constant increase, and what are you doing about it? And some of it is related to historical issues that they cannot solve for, or that happened 10 years ago, but they constantly have this incremental thing. So the question then becomes for utilities, what are you doing in terms of systems, controls, processes, procedures, human resources? How are you ensuring that in future this continues to come down? And unfortunately, the way that they record and they report it in the annual reports or in the AFS looks like they're not doing anything. And this is why this gazette was so important. But unfortunately, the way it was worded was absolutely incorrect, and it had to be withdrawn. And the AG definitely has to step in how it is worded in future.
All right. And here's where we're going to end it. And I'm hoping for quite a short answer. I'm pressed for time. You end your sentence with the AG, the Auditor General. We are told that they are going to have more consultations with her office. And yet, at the same time, one of the representatives of Treasury says, we had extensive consultations. So someone is lying here that the Auditor General was not consulted. Or could the answer lie in whether or not the ratings agencies may have come in here and started signaling warnings about Eskom and its potential to get credit?
So both of those things could very well be true. I did give commentary earlier this week saying that if I was a ratings agency or an Eskom creditor, I'd be extremely worried about what was said, and it would encourage me to dig deeper and do further due diligence on what has been happening at Eskom. I do believe that the AG was consulted, maybe not at an extensive scale, but surely the wording of the Gazette should not have provided a blanket approval or a blanket sort of solution, whether it's for fruitless, wasteful, irregular, as well as corruption in there. The wording should have been very clear that it is excluding certain items that are breaches of PFMA as a result of increased prices or whatever other reasons. However, there are certain things that need to be reported on, whether you like it or not. And Eskom has said that they will report on these things. The problem was the Gazette and the way it was written.
Lungile Mashele, energy economist, thank you very much for putting things slightly more into perspective.